I want you to imagine the shock in American border towns when they realized that decades of reliable Canadian tourism had vanished, not because of policy changes or economic crisis, but because millions of Canadian families had simply chosen dignity over convenience and stopped crossing the border. I've been studying cross-border economic relationships for decades, and I can tell you that the collapse of Canadian tourism to the United States represents something unprecedented in modern North American history. Not just because of the scale of the economic damage, though that has been devastating for communities that built their survival around Canadian visitors, but because it demonstrates how quickly fundamental economic relationships can dissolve when respect disappears and dignity becomes more valuable than convenience. The public story, as it appeared in tourism statistics and economic reports, looked like a routine downturn in cross-border travel. Fewer Canadian license plates in American border town parking lots, declining hotel occupancy rates, reduced retail sales in communities that had traditionally depended on Canadian shoppers, standard economic indicators that could be explained by currency fluctuations, travel restrictions, or changing consumer preferences. But what actually happened was far more consequential than any routine market adjustment. What happened was that millions of Canadian families made individual decisions that collectively added up to an economic earthquake. They decided that being treated with contempt wasn't worth saving money on vacation destinations, that dignity was more valuable than convenient cross-border shopping, and that there were plenty of other places in the world to spend their tourism dollars. To understand how devastating this transformation was for American border communities, you have to understand the economic foundation that Canadian tourism had provided for decades. These weren't luxury destinations competing with Paris or Hawaii for discretionary spending. These were communities that had built their entire economic identity around being the convenient, affordable option for Canadian families looking for weekend getaways, shopping trips, and budget vacations. The relationship was so reliable that American businesses planned around it. Hotels forecasted occupancy rates based on Canadian holiday schedules. Restaurants staffed for Canadian long weekends. Retail stores stocked inventory based on Canadian shopping patterns. Gas stations, attractions, and service industries all oriented their operations around the predictable flow of Canadian visitors who treated cross-border travel as routine as going to a different neighborhood. When that flow stopped, it wasn't gradual or partial. It was sudden and complete in ways that caught everyone off guard. Canadian families didn't reduce their travel to America. They redirected it. Instead of driving 2 hours south for a weekend in an American border town, they drove 2 hours north to Canadian destinations. Instead of shopping in American outlet malls, they discovered Canadian alternatives. Instead of booking familiar American vacation spots, they explored European, Caribbean, or domestic options. What made this redirection particularly devastating for American communities was how little warning they received. Canadian tourists didn't announce boycotts or issue statements about their travel decisions. They simply started making different choices about how to spend their vacation time and money. The absence was noticed only after it became a pattern that was too obvious to ignore. The human dimension of this story is particularly heartbreaking because it affects people who had built their livelihoods around relationships they thought were permanent. Small business owners who had served Canadian customers for decades discovered that familiarity meant nothing when respect disappeared. Hotel managers who had hosted Canadian families year after year found themselves managing empty properties during what should have been peak season. Restaurant owners who had learned to serve Canadian preferences, who had hired staff who spoke French, who had adjusted their menus and service styles to accommodate Canadian visitors, suddenly found themselves with half-empty dining rooms during weekends when they used to be fully booked. The economic damage was immediate and obvious, but the emotional impact was even more profound for people who had considered their Canadian customers to be neighbors rather than just sources of revenue. From Canada's perspective, the decision to vacation elsewhere wasn't coordinated or strategic. It was organic and emotional. Canadian families didn't need government encouragement to avoid spending money in a country where they felt unwelcome. When political rhetoric treats your country as subordinate, when diplomatic relationships become hostile, when you're made to feel like your presence is tolerated rather than appreciated, vacation decisions become easy to make. Canadian tourism operators began actively promoting this redirection by highlighting domestic destinations and international alternatives. Tourism campaigns that had once competed with American destinations for Canadian travelers began emphasizing the advantages of keeping vacation dollars in Canada or exploring destinations where Canadian visitors were genuinely welcomed rather than simply accommodated. The economic multiplier effects of this tourism collapse spread far beyond the businesses that directly served Canadian visitors. When hotels empty, it affects laundry services, food suppliers, maintenance contractors, and dozens of other businesses that depend on tourism infrastructure. When restaurants close early because of reduced traffic, it affects food distributors, equipment suppliers, and staff who lose hours or jobs entirely. Local governments felt the impact through reduced tax revenues from sales taxes, hotel taxes, and business licensing fees. Communities that had collected millions of dollars annually from Canadian tourism found themselves facing budget shortfalls that forced cuts to public services, infrastructure maintenance, and community programs. The fiscal stress rippled through every aspect of local government operations. What's particularly striking about this tourism collapse is how it revealed the dependency that American border communities had developed on Canadian economic activity without ever acknowledging that dependency politically. Towns that built their identities around American entrepreneurship and self-sufficiency discovered that their survival had actually depended on Canadian generosity and goodwill. The contrast with Canadian communities was stark and telling. While American border towns struggled with empty hotels and closed businesses, Canadian tourism destinations experienced unprecedented growth as domestic tourism redirected toward destinations that had previously competed with American alternatives. Canadian families discovered vacation opportunities in their own country that they had overlooked while cheaper American options were convenient. This redirection created a positive feedback loop within the Canadian economy that made the shift away from American tourism self-reinforcing. As Canadian destinations improved their offerings to capture redirected tourism dollars, they became more competitive with American alternatives, even if political relationships eventually improved. Infrastructure investments, service improvements, and marketing campaigns all made domestic Canadian tourism more attractive relative to cross-border alternatives. The international implications of this tourism collapse extended beyond bilateral relationships into broader questions about how political rhetoric affects economic relationships. When political leaders treat neighboring countries with contempt, it affects not just government-to-government relationships, but people-to-people connections that support economic integration across borders. Other countries watched this dynamic and adjusted their own tourism strategies accordingly. European destinations began targeting Canadian tourists more aggressively, offering alternatives to traditional American vacation destinations. Caribbean resorts adjusted their marketing to emphasize Canadian rather than American customers. The global tourism industry recognized that Canadian tourists were looking for alternatives to American destinations and positioned themselves accordingly. The diplomatic dimension of this tourism collapse forced American officials to confront the economic consequences of political rhetoric in ways that trade disputes or policy disagreements never could. When millions of individual families make decisions that collectively devastate your communities, it's impossible to dismiss the impact as temporary or manageable. The damage is visible, immediate, and personal for the people whose livelihoods depend on tourist dollars. What makes this situation particularly difficult to reverse is how it changed Canadian perceptions of American hospitality in fundamental ways. Once families develop vacation habits that don't include American destinations, once they discover alternatives that meet their needs without the stress of hostile political relationships, once they build new traditions around domestic or international destinations, those patterns become self-sustaining. The children who grow up taking family vacations in Europe rather than America, who develop traditions around Canadian destinations rather than American ones, who associate travel with exploring the world rather than exploring next door, will carry those preferences into their own family decisions. Cultural shifts in vacation patterns can persist for generations once they become established. For American tourism operators, this reality forced a fundamental recalibration of business models that had been built around Canadian reliability. Industries that had taken Canadian tourism for granted discovered that they needed to compete for Canadian visitors in ways they had never needed to before. Markets that had been captive became competitive, and competition revealed weaknesses that had been hidden by proximity and habit. The most sobering aspect of this entire crisis is how it demonstrates that economic relationships built on convenience can dissolve quickly when convenience is no longer worth the cost to dignity. Canadian families didn't need complex economic analysis to decide that being treated with respect was worth paying more for vacation destinations or traveling further for shopping opportunities. The tourism apocalypse reveals more than an economic dependency that American border communities had never fully acknowledged. It reveals how quickly relationships that seem permanent can evaporate when they're taken for granted. When neighbors stop being neighborly, when visitors stop feeling welcome, when convenience is outweighed by contempt, the economic consequences follow as predictably as empty parking lots and closed businesses. As this transformation continues to reshape tourism patterns across North America, what becomes clear is that restoring Canadian tourism to American destinations will require more than marketing campaigns or economic incentives. It will require rebuilding the respect and hospitality that made American destinations attractive to Canadian families in the first place. And once respect is lost, rebuilding it takes far longer than losing it ever did.